Okay. So I see we have, yes, Cody from Synology. You're on?
Yes, sir. Right
How are
here.
you today?
Good.
Awesome.
How's everybody doing?
Thank you for joining today. Good, good. Thank you. You ready to jump in and get started?
Yeah, if everybody's all ready to go, I'll just go ahead and share my screen and we'll jump right into it.
Awesome.
So let me minimize this right here. So first and foremost, welcome VMUG community. This is the Synology portion of today's session. I'm glad to see that we've already seen some Synology in some of the presentations previously. I'm always really excited to work with the VMUG community because there's always some really good questions. We actually have a couple other Synology experts in the chat. So if you have any questions for us, you can get that answered during the presentation. They're also going to be making some of those questions apparent to me on our back end here, and I will be answering those questions as a group near the end of the presentation. Keep in mind, we're also going to be doing a raffle and that kind of thing. We're going to have a survey that needs to be done if you want to be a part of that. So make sure you take the survey that we'll also be posting inside of the chat portion as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into things. We're going to first start off by looking into license-free backup and high availability storage with the Synology ecosystem to create a tiered disaster recovery strategy for your VMware environment, whether it's in the home lab or in a data center, for example. So a little bit about myself before we jump into things here. I'm Cody. I'm a product manager. I've been with the firm for about 2 years now. And previously in a past life for about 5 years, I worked at an MSP, managed service provider, where I actually did infrastructure cabling. I deployed some networks. I also deployed Synology in the field. So I have some firsthand knowledge about how some packages we're going to take a look at today, namely snapshot replication and active backup for business, has actually helped save businesses and help just take care of that precious information that you might have on your systems, be it in iSCSI or just as a normal file server. So of course, why are we looking to back up things? You have accidents, you have your employee's computer might be lost, destroyed, maybe they spilled coffee or Mountain Dew on it. And you also have attacks on top of that. So of course we have ransomware becoming ever more prevalent, especially if you're using devices as a file server. Lots of times that can propagate across map drives and that kind of thing. Now with testing, that's just another added benefit you get with your backups. You can actually take your backup images, spin them up in other locations, sandbox different updates and that kind of thing, so that you can then test them to make sure you don't break anything in production. So these 3 different features here, these 3 different categories are going to be why you want to actually back up your system. So today's walkthrough is going to be focusing on high availability storage for VMware, and then we're moving into backup and restoration of those VMs and PCs that we get into that virtualized environment. And then we're also going to do offsite backup and disaster recovery for both LUNs and also that VM data that we're going to back up with active backup for business. Now, we're going to move into high availability storage for VMware first, but for anyone watching that isn't familiar with Synology itself, we make network attached storage, and that's our main product. We have some routers and that kind of thing, but Synology NAS is our main bread and butter. And we actually have devices that are, at the terabyte scale, just a couple bays, and they can actually scale out to, the petabyte scale with some of our SA3400 devices. They can have somewhere in the range of 7 expansion units. So you can start out small with a couple 2-bay devices in your home lab and actually expand those units out and migrate to much larger units that might even have Xeon processors and that kind of thing that's more at the enterprise scale. So you can start small and scale out later with their easy migration tools to help you lift and shift your data to a new NAS whenever you need to. So the big kicker here with Synology, though, is, of course, you get access to our operating system that is Disk Station Manager, and it's a web-based operating system, and it's windowed, so it's going to feel a lot like a desktop operating system you're used to, that being Windows, Linux, that kind of thing. And you can have access to over 100 first and third-party packages. And what I like to say about Synology is it's kind of like a little IT Swiss Army knife. And it's actually a pretty short learning curve to do what is traditionally pretty complex IT operations. With Synology, even if you're not a veteran of the system, even if you're not fluent in the system, its wizard-based operations are going to be easy for you to follow along with. Now, we're going to be focusing mainly on storage for virtualization today, and that's actually something that Synology is known for the world over. As mentioned, we do really great with iSCSI, and you can even split off your storage any which way you need. But storage for virtualization is something we're known for because we're pretty much certified for virtualization storage with all of the hypervisors you see in the wild today, that being, of course, VMware, Citrix, Hyper-V, and OpenStack, and that's pretty much the works there. We also have support for advanced iSCSI integrations that you would expect from your virtualization storage, that being, of course, VAI, multipath input-output, and thin and thick provisioning. Now, just to be clear about what we're focusing on today, we have, of course, our VM host. That's going to be your ESXi host. It's going to be connected over iSCSI with the Synology NAS device. Now, the reason why you would want to do this is for expandable storage of that VM host. That VM host that you have, your ESXi image might be sitting on a SATA DOM, for example, or there might not be very many drive bays in that chassis itself. So it would be pretty hard to actually expand that out in the same way that you can expand Synology devices. So by connecting over iSCSI, exposing that iSCSI LUN to your ESXi environment and populating with VM data, you're able to expand your storage nice and easy without actually ever really turning off the VM host itself. Now let's walk through configuring Synology as a VMware storage node really quick here. So we're going to hop over to our main NAS device. It's going to be the one we're going to focus on most of today. So we're going to go over here and open up our iSCSI storage manager. And you can see we already have a LUN ready to go. It's already mapped back to our ESXi environment that we have here in the home lab. Now, if you're not familiar, this is just going to be a main snapshot of how your iSCSI environment's doing. And under target, you can create targets, likewise with LUNs and snapshots we're going to touch on a little bit later in a later demo. Now, under target, as you can see, we're already connected to our ESXi environment, but let's go ahead and walk through creating this target here. So we're going to just rename this target just to make it nice and easy to identify. We're just going to leave it on VMUG. And I'll rename the target name here at the end so we can easily find it later. I'm also going to copy this IQN here for later injection into the ESXi environment. And you can see that we can enable CHAP here if you wanted to, if you needed that extra handshake, but we're not going to be messing with that today. So we're going to move on here. And as you can see, just in one screen, we created the target. Next click, it's creating the LUN now. So it's a nice, easy workflow that allows you to immediately map the LUN back to the target you just created. So we're going to create a new LUN with this. We're going to rename this VMUG like we've renamed everything else so far. And you can see we're just going to leave it on this small volume here. And we're going to just have it set to be 15 gigabytes. If we drill down into the advanced features, you're going to see that both thick and thin provisioning have support for hardware-assisted zeroing and locking. But by sticking with thick provisioning, you're actually saying, I don't want to use hardware-assisted data transfer, snapshots, and space reclamation, which I think all three of those features are definitely handy, especially in the home lab. Space reclamation is a very handy feature because your storage space is at a premium in your home lab. So for the use of this session today, we're going to be using thin provisioning because we're going to be focusing on snapshots a little bit later with our LUNs. So we definitely need that. And we want to use pretty much all of these advanced features here. So we're going to go ahead and hit apply. And pretty much almost immediately, this target is ready to go. Likewise, the LUN is also over here, ready to go. We didn't have to wait, hours and hours for anything to provision. It's ready to go. We're ready to bring it into VMware now. So we're hopping over to our ESXi environment. It's a free ESXi environment in this entire session today. Although you can definitely have this managed by a vCenter server. You could have the Synology device be iSCSI storage for a clustered environment if you needed to. We can definitely do that. But this is going to be great for any of you home lab users that are just sticking with the free stuff right now. So you can see that we have a couple VMs in here right now. Of course, we're going to go to our iSCSI adapter and configure. And we're going to add in that target we grabbed when we created our target and LUN just a bit ago. Now we're going to use this 192.168.1.236 because that is our cluster IP for the Synology NAS device. And you can see we're pretty much good to go. All we would need to do is save here, and we would be able to then create a VMware data store. But before we do that, especially since we're in a free ESXi environment, I changed some of these timeouts here. And we actually have a guide for this on our knowledge base. So if you don't catch this, you can definitely find that. It's inside of the guide for using a Synology NAS as a VMware data store on the Synology knowledge base. What I did was I changed the login timeout from 30 seconds to 60 seconds. I changed the no operations timeout from 15 seconds to 30 seconds, and I disabled delayed acknowledgement. This is especially going to be helpful whenever we do a Synology high availability switchover of the storage portion of this whole virtualization environment. It's going to allow us to enforce these longer timeouts so we don't have to reset or reboot the VM while that switchover occurs. So now that we got all that set, again, if you didn't catch that, that's on our knowledge base if you need it. And we can go ahead and save this config here. We're going to rescan and refresh, of course. And you can see now we have that 15 gigabyte LUN exposed to our ESXi environment now. Of course, what we'll need to do is go into new data store and then rename it, of course, and go ahead and select how much space you want to use. We're just going to do it all in this case. And we're on VMFS6 here. And now, of course, if we go to data store, we now have this data store exposed to our system. So we could then begin populating it with VM data and start using it in our home lab or in production. Now, on the topic of high availability, we're going to see this on a couple 2-bay devices. So you can have high availability for the Synology storage node on just a couple 2-bay devices. The really main requirement for this is they each need to have identical everything. They need to be identical devices, RAM, hard drives. And also they need 2 NICs each. So one for the heartbeat connection and one each for the cluster IP connection to the network. Now the heartbeat connection is what syncs data from NAS A, the active server, to NAS B, the passive server. So as that's happening, NAS B is essentially lying in wait, while NAS A is the one you're actually interacting with through the cluster IP and namespace in general. Now, if there's ever an issue with NAS A, let's say someone again spills coffee on it or kicks it, or something falls on the device and damages it in some way, you can have an manual or automatic failover occur whenever that hardware issue happens, so that all the services will then fail over to NAS B. Now, what's really great about this, whenever NAS B becomes the active server again, you create a unique IP address and name for the Synology high availability cluster. So you're still accessing the whole cluster environment through the same namespace in this sense. So you don't need to do any kind of retargeting with a new IP address or remapping mapped drives if you're using it as a file server. So it's definitely handy in that case. So let's walk through High Availability Manager and how to set up that automatic failover and a couple other things you should consider. So we're moving back over to our main NAS environment here. Go ahead and move this out of the way. And we're going to go ahead and open High Availability Manager here. So the NAS that we're mainly working on today is actually a Synology High Availability Cluster. And you can see we have one node that is the active server as node 1, and node 2 is the passive server, and we're all healthy and good to go so far. Now, this main page is going to be where you can manage kind of the physical portions of the cluster. You can remove the passive server, remove the cluster if you needed to do maintenance. And likewise, you can also do some software maintenance here, updating packages and DSM, the operating system. You can also shut down the devices here. That's going to be the main things that you can do. Here's going to be your main snapshot of the health of the cluster as a whole. Under host is going to be what you can use to actually tell the two devices apart. You can power them down and that kind of thing. But again, this magnifying glass is going to be what allows you to find the device if you don't have access to the serial number. Maybe you have a very crowded rack, or it's kind of buried in the closet or something like that, and you don't have access to the serial number. You can make one of these devices blink and beep at you so that you can tell which one is which. Because again, they are going to be completely identical in every other way. Under network, you're going to be able to change your host name's name on the actual network itself. And under manage network interface here, you're going to be able to change, the network interface for the individual nodes in the cluster. Now, the biggest portion of the entire manager, in my opinion, is going to be this service section. That's going to be where you enable the automatic failover. So since we're talking about virtualization storage today, we're going to definitely want to check iSCSI targets in this case. So if there's ever an issue with the iSCSI target service on the active server, it would trigger an automatic failover. Likewise, if I'm using the device as an SMB file server or FTP, AFP, etc., you'd want to actually check those boxes as well. So if something happened to those services too, it would cause a failover. Now, this automatic failover is definitely a handy tool, but if you're going to be using automatic failovers, make sure you use the quorum server. Now, the quorum server is a server that is basically a third-party mediator to the active and passive nodes in the cluster. It's a server that runs 24/7, so you could set it to something like your DNS server. In my case, it's just the typical router IP address. And what this basically does is if the passive server thinks it should be doing a automatic failover, it'll first try and ping the quorum server. And if it can't reach the quorum server, that usually means there's some other network issue occurring in general. So having that failover occur could actually cause what's called a split brain error. And now this happens whenever both of them become active at the same time. And there's a remediation process that you need to follow to get that all cleared up. So having the quorum server in place will stop any of those erroneous passive failovers from happening, because it'll have some kind of third-party server to actually reach out to make sure it is a proper time to do one of those switchovers. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and do a switchover here right now. We're going to move back to our main cluster page. We're going to go side by side here. Just one moment. And you can see under Navigator, we have our virtual machine. We're going to be using this elementary OS device here. Let me go ahead and log into it. Just a lightweight Linux VM. So what we're going to do is begin a switch over here and say we know all the warnings here. And what this is going to do is going to be bringing node 2 as the active server in this case. So what's happening now on the left, you can see we are beginning the failover process. So the first portion you lose access to during a switchover or failover is the DSM web portal access. That's the first thing that begins failing over. Then other services like iSCSI, SMB, NFS, et cetera, will begin to fail over to the second node in this case. So you actually have the ability to interact with the VM for a little bit while it is actually performing the switchover. So as you can see, I can open up files and that kind of thing. But as the iSCSI service begins to fail over to the second node, what will happen first is the iSCSI service, NFS, SMB, et cetera, will be the ones that come up first on that end, and then we'll refresh on the left-hand pane here and gain access to DSM once more. So what's going to happen here as I click around is eventually my operations will be queued, and the iSCSI timeouts are being recognized and enforced as that iSCSI service fails over. So as those operations are queued, they will then be pushed out to the VM once the switchover is all finished. So as you can see, I'm trying to exit out of the files here and it's now paused. That's because the VM is recognizing the iSCSI timeouts right now. And you're going to see in just a few seconds, all the operations I just did will then be flushed to the VM once iSCSI service comes back up. We won't need to reboot the VM. We won't need to reset the VM. We'll just be able to continue chugging along. And all this looks like to the user on the other end is that there's a brief pause in the VM and then all the operations are pushed through. Now, with this, in just a couple seconds, you're going to see it start back up. And one thing to keep in mind is SHA is about a 1-minute failover, and we'll be exploring some other failover options. But as you can see on the right hand, we actually had all those operations flushed for the system. You can see I can now interact with the VM, no problem. There was no need to actually do any resets or reboots. And we're now gaining access to DSM on the left. Likewise, I'm also hearing an audible beep from my tech closet here at the home lab saying that the switchover has occurred. Now on the left hand, you can see that the sync is occurring between node 2 and node 1, just making sure that all of the data is in sync between the active-passive cluster relationship. They're just making sure that all of that is synced together correctly before moving on. And as you can see, we're healthy and good to go. And that switchover was definitely successful. So now, again, for the home lab today, what you just saw that switchover occur on was a couple 2-bay devices. There are two Synology DS718 Plus devices. That device actually recently got refreshed. So what you see on screen here is two DS720 Plus devices. They're kind of the newer, revamped version of those devices. So you can definitely have a couple of these devices in your home lab to use Synology High Availability. Now, if you're kind of using Synology in the enterprise scale, you might be looking at something more along the lines of the UC3200. And this is an active IP SAN with Synology. There's a 4-core Xeon in each one of the controllers and a 5-year warranty. So that's more enterprise features and in line with enterprise life cycles. Now, the difference between this and Synology High Availability, since there's dual controllers, the heartbeat actually occurs over PCI bus in general. So there's actually more bandwidth available to the heartbeat connection. So the syncs occur quicker, and there's also lower latency on top of it. So you have quicker failover on top of that. So this automatic failover in the UC3200 is non-disruptive iSCSI service because it happens in sub 30 seconds. So we've seen this device used in mission critical environments like 911 call centers, for example. Now let's talk a little bit about the difference between Synology High Availability and the UC3200 or the SA3200D, which are both dual controller models. With the active passive cluster, you have fully redundant storage. So you have redundancy all the way down to the storage media itself. Like what you saw today, we have two DS718 Pluses connected together. You have to buy completely identical units, including the hard drives, and have these hard drives placed into their corresponding bay on the secondary unit even. So with that said, if you wanted to make a customized Synology High Availability solution, you could definitely do so and choose something like a SA3400 or even a flash station that you could put into an active passive cluster. But keep in mind, since you're getting redundancy at the storage media level, your hard drive line item is definitely going to be the most expensive portion. And in fact, it's actually going to be the most expensive line item on pretty much any deployment. But what you get with the active passive cluster with Synology High Availability is you get the customizable option to do all flash arrays or SAS enabled arrays and that kind of thing. With the UC3200, it is shared storage, so you don't need to buy redundant storage media. Each controller can create their own storage pool and manage that from the same set of up to 36 drives. So your line item for the hard drives themselves on this deployment is going to be much less. If you have any questions about which solution you should go with, which direction you should go for your virtualization infrastructure, please reach out to Synology. We have some links at the end of this presentation. You should be getting a PDF copy on top of that. So feel free to reach out to us anytime. We can definitely provide some guidance. So let's talk about backup and restoring VMs and PCs. Now we got data onto the specific virtualization infrastructure, so we need to know how to take care of all of that data now. So with our data management woes today, we all know that we have our data scattered across several of these objects, sometimes all of them, sometimes just a couple. But of course, to get these all backed up, you would need to have more than one backup program in general to actually get all of that taken care of, at least traditionally. So you'd have some mix of computers, Windows PCs, you might even have some tossed in the closet that you haven't seen in a while. There's also file servers, virtual machines with VMware and Hyper-V, of course, and then your software as a service. So you need something like Active Backup for Business to help unify the backup for VMs, PCs, servers, and software as a service. So Active Backup for Business can help aggregate all that data onto a Synology NAS device. And then once all that data is finally in one location, it becomes much easier to manage and it's much more flexible. You're going to be able to then back it up to the cloud, replicate it to another NAS if you wanted to fail over to a secondary Synology NAS device. So with this, you actually have a little bit more flexibility by having all your data locally in one location. And also, you only need to be the master of one product suite, and there's only one support network to go through. You're not going to have to bounce between all these different objects or sometimes more than one program to get to the root cause of the backup issue. You can just work with Synology to get the issue resolved. So VM backups, which is the main meat and potatoes of today, is going to be a good thing for anyone, even in the home lab or in the data center. It's agentless for vSphere, so you don't have to go into every VM and put in an agent and all that stuff. You just basically expose your ESXi environment to Active Backup for Business by authenticating with your admin credentials, for example. And then you're able to see into your ESXi environment and begin backing up the VMs almost immediately. Now, you can also make these application-aware backups. Now, these are this is just a simple checkbox whenever you're creating the task itself. And there's a couple other legwork things you need to do on the other end, like having VMware tools installed on the device. And if it's a Windows server, for example, having volume shadow copy service enabled on that as well. Definitely check out the application-aware backups if you're using Active Backup for Business to back up, mission-critical stuff like SQL servers, that kind of thing. You definitely want to use application-aware backups in that sense. Now, these are full and forever incremental backups, and what that really means is that we have support for change block tracking. Keep in mind, in free ESXi, that needs to be enabled on a VM by VM basis, and we have a guide for doing that. But what this allows you to do is just back up that change data after that initial backup so that you're not backing up that entire VM each and every time. So after that initial one, it should go a little bit quicker. And of course, all of the things we're going to be talking about today is completely license free. Now, this is really important for the home lab user. You can, if you have a Synology NAS device, or if you win our DS220 Plus raffle, you'll be able to use Active Backup for Business right out of the box, essentially. And even if you're a data center guy with lots of hosts, lots of sockets and VMs and that kind of thing, Active Backup doesn't even care. You can use Active Backup for Business and Synology in your data center with impunity, with no extra fees or charges. Now, let's go ahead and demo configuring the vSphere backup. And of course, we're going to hop back over to our trusty HA cluster here and open up Active Backup for Business. You're going to see your main overview page here, and we're going to pop right down to virtual machine. You can see we have a couple of those VMs that you saw previously in our ESXi environment. It's already connected back to that .10 host here. Now, all you would need to do to add your own hypervisor is go to Manage Hypervisor, and you could click Add here. You could then type in the IP address of your free ESXi environment. For me, I gave it my root password since I'm just, again, on a free ESXi license. But for my lab back at the office with vCenter, for example, you can type in your fully qualified domain name. For us, it'd be vsphere.slab.local. And then I typed in my domain administrator credentials to actually add in that hypervisor in that case. So it definitely works in clustered environments. But all you would need to do is add in that information here and hit apply, and you would be able to see it connect like this and be online. Once you do that, you should see all of your VMs across that host. And if you're in a clustered environment, you'd see all the individual nodes that are part of the cluster and the VMs underneath that. So you can see we have some tasks already created for this main elementary OS backup. So we're going to create another task for this one just to show you how to do it. And this Windows Server 2016 image here, that is actually managed by another NAS in this home lab. So we will be looking at that backup in a little bit. So we're going to create a task here, and we're going to choose where we want it to live. We're just going to name it VMUG again. And we're going to choose our elementary OS VM. Now, again, if you had more than one even individual ESXi hosts paired to Active Backup for Business, you'd see them individually placed here. And you could back up all the VMs across all your hosts, or pick and choose which ones across many if you needed to. For us, we're just going to grab one. And again, if you're in a clustered environment, it could see directly through all that cluster. You could drill down nice and easy. Now, this next page is going to be where you can enable a lot of the advanced features with Active Backup for Business, like application-aware backup, transfer compression, encryption, etc. Now, one thing I want to make note of for pretty much any wizard you walk through with Synology is these information bubbles. You're going to want to hover over these to actually see if there's any other legwork you need to do. Like, again, with application-aware backups, we need VMware tools and VSS enabled on your Windows server, for example, if you wanted to use that for this. So make sure you take heed of those information bubbles as you go through things. Now, this data transfer compression, I don't think we really need on our network. It's for a slower network to help reduce the time of backups, but that can be definitely helpful if you're showing, if you think your network's running a little slow. And we're going to disable that. And now you have also transfer encryption. That's always a good one to choose anytime you're moving data around. And you can also enable source data store usage detection. That's actually for the VMware data store. What this means is Active Backup will fail the task if it sees that the data store for that actual VM is actually filling up too much. So of course, whenever your LUN gets too full, it'll go into a read-only state, and we don't want that to happen, especially in production. So Active Backup can actually tell when that data store is getting a little too full up, and it'll actually fail that task so that you're not taking up that last precious space as you're ordering more hard drives to expand the LUN or what have you. Now, backup verification is something we're going to touch on in a little bit for VMs, but our virtual machine manager is a KVM-based hypervisor directly on the NAS device itself. And what this actually does, it will take the active backup image and boot it as a ghost VM directly inside of virtual machine manager. And it takes a low resolution video of the time you specify here of the VM getting to its login screen actually booting up. So you'll have video proof that your backups are correct and functional and that you can rely on them with backup verification. We'll be doing a couple restores into virtual machine manager in just a little bit. We're going to hit next here. And of course, you can enable your schedule. It can be manual. You can schedule it to be daily, pretty much any day of the week, however you want to do it. And you can have it happen up to every hour. Now, you can also set a backup window. This is a pretty new feature that we have, and I definitely think it's handy for admins or anyone who does, work during the day. You could block out these backups to actually not run during the day, let's say 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., for example, so they're not running during your working hours. Or you could do some kind of custom solution like this and pop in a couple different spots where it can run midday, maybe. But for us, in our sense, we're just going to let it run all the time. We're going to hit next, and this is going to be the retention policy. Now, you can keep all versions with Active Backup for Business because it is global block level deduplication across virtual machines, physical servers, and PCs. So it won't take up that much space since it's deduplicating against itself. But if you wanted to set up a rotation policy, a retention policy, you could set up a custom one using these fields here, set up a grandfather, father, son scenario, or something else that you custom make in this menu. We're going to go next here and then apply our permissions. I'm going to give permissions to myself here, but of course you can do it by local users and groups. And if you're bound by a domain or LDAP or something along those lines, you will be able to see those users as well. You could then give permissions to those domain-based users. Now we're going to hit apply here, and we're actually not going to run the backup since we already got one running, but that's how easy it is to set up vSphere backups for your VMs with Active Backup for Business. So we're going to move into Windows PC backup. That's going to be another big one for a lot of the home lab users and that kind of thing. And it's file level or system level backups. And you also can back up the external drives that might be plugged into your system. Now, these backups can be scheduled just like your VM backups on Active Backup for Business, or they can be triggered based on if you log out or it's the end of the day or something along those lines for that workstation itself. And it supports mass deployment. We have an MSI file for Active Backup for Business. We have a guide for editing it. All you need is a table editor like Orca that you get with, I believe, the Windows SDK. I believe that's where that one is packaged. And in that MSI file, you can edit it to have all the attributes for your actual NAS device. And then you just take that MSI file and push it out via a group policy object through Active Directory or something along those lines to help you with that mass deployment. Now let's demo setting up a PC backup task here. So we're actually going to hop over to another NAS that we have on our system here. Just one second. Back on this one. We're going to minimize here. We're going to go ahead and open up our tray icon for Active Backup. And we have our active backup agent running right here. So if we double click it, you can see it pops right open. This is going to be an agent you can download off of our download center. And all you really need to do is just type in the IP address of your NAS and your new username and credentials, and then you can then pair the workstation to the system. With our active backup for business instance, in this case, you can see under PC, we have this laptop right here. We have several tasks that we've already created in the past for this, but let's go ahead and walk through creating another task here. You can see we can rename this task nice and easy. We're going to name it VMUG New Jersey. I'm going to hit next here and choose where it wants to live once more. And then you can back up your entire device, back up just external hard drives, system volumes, or you can do a customized volume. Now, with a laptop or something like that, you're pretty much only going to have a C drive. So we're not going to back up by a custom volume. We'll just do the entire device. And you can see transfer, compression, and encryption are enabled by default in this case. Now, this page is going to look a little bit different from the VM backup schedule because you have the ability to trigger the event. So you can, of course, do a scheduled event, do it daily, weekends, etc. Of course, hourly once again. But you can back up by an event, let's say screen lock, sign out, or startup, and select your backup interval here. So that's helpful for the workstation PCs so that the backups occur whenever that person leaves for the day, for example. Now, you can also set a backup window, just like you saw with the VM backups. It's pretty much the same exact menu. You can block things out during working hours, or let's say, or you can block things out to have it happen all the time. We're going to hit next here, and then we're going to keep all versions in this sense because we have block level deduplication here. And we're going to go ahead and hit apply. We're not going to back up now because, as you can see, I got quite a few ones here. But that's going to be how you actually run that backup. And right before we actually started this event here, while the previous speaker was going on, we have a backup that ran pretty much right at that moment in time. And it was just finishing up right as we started this session here today. So with these recovery options, you have a couple different options depending on what object you're looking at. So you can see Windows Server and VMware Hyper-V VMs. They have pretty much all of the recovery options you could think of that we have available. So with Windows Server and Hyper-V, you could take a Windows Server and spin it up in your virtualization environment. Doesn't matter if it's VMware or Hyper-V. You could also spin it up inside of our virtual machine manager that's directly on the Synology box. And with VMware and Hyper-V, the most interesting recovery option besides instant restore, which helps you get up and running within seconds, is also the cross-platform recovery. You can take a Hyper-V VM, for example, and restore it into your VMware environment and vice versa if you wanted to. Now, you'll see Windows PC doesn't have some of these other objects listed here, like Instant Restore to VM or a cross-platform or Instant Restore to VMM. That's just actually an organizational flag. You can actually promote a Windows PC to be a Windows Server category. It's just, again, a category in the system. Whenever you do that, you then have access to all of the Windows Server recovery options. You can then instant restore that PC into your VM host or spin it up on the Synology NAS box itself. Now, on the topic of this full restore versus instant restore, with the full restore, there's an issue with the VM host in this scenario, and the Synology NAS backup destination is actually then going to restore the entire backup image to the production site in this case. Now, your recovery time whenever this occurs is fixing the issues on the host, restoring the VM, doing that full data transfer, and then booting it on the VM host, of course. Now, with the instant restore to VMware, if there's ever an issue on the VM host, with the Synology NAS backup destination, what you can then do with the instant restore is mount that backup image as an NFS data store directly for that VM host on the Synology NAS. So what that means is your recovery time is really about booting a VM, since you're not actually doing any of that data transfer. Now, whenever you're ready to actually finalize any of the changes you made to the instant restore VM while you were working on it in the disaster recovery scenario, you then use the migrate VM button inside of Active Backup for Business, which allows you to vMotion that data off of that NFS data store and back onto the production data store, which coincidentally might be an iSCSI LUN on the NAS itself. Now, what's good about this is it allows you to kind of forego that initial large data transfer whenever you're trying to do one of these restores to a time whenever it's off-peak hours, and then you can just use those handy tools from VMware, that being vMotion, to move that data off of the NFS data store. So let's demo that instant restore here. And we're going to hop back over to our ESXi environment actually first here. And we're going to take this elementary OS VM, and we're going to go ahead and delete it here. We're going to power it off, of course, and go ahead and delete. Of course, we're going to hop back over to the NAS that was taking care of that VM. That was our HA cluster, if you remember. And we're going to hop back over here. So this refresh button lets it recall out to your VMware environment to see if there's been any changes. You can do that automatically or manually, but manually doing it, you can see it can now tell that it's missing a VM. What Active Backup is telling you with this warning here is that I have a couple versions of this VM, but I don't see it in the list anymore. Something needs to be done. You're going to need to restore or do something along those lines. So we're going to go ahead and do an instant restore. We're just going to highlight the VM and hit restore. We're going to go to VMware vSphere, but of course you have a couple other options if you needed to. And we're going to do an instant restore to this location. We're going to use the backup that we took just this morning. And we're going to restore to the original location. Now, the restore to a new location is handy if you're in a clustered environment or if you have more than one individual ESXi nodes paired back to Active Backup for Business. The restore to a new location is going to allow you to pick it up and drop it into a different node in your system, into a different spot that is paired to Active Backup for Business. So for us in our home lab, we have one ESXi host, so we're just going to restore it to the original location. And we're going to power on the VM automatically after restoration and hit apply. We're going to hop right back over to ESXi real quick because it happens pretty fast. So we're going to hit apply. And you can see on the bottom here, it's already creating pathways and interacting with your ESXi host as you would expect. And you can see it's beginning to populate the VM here. And I'll get a question from VMware in just a second. We're going to say moved it, answer. And you can see it is all booting up here. And that is the Elementary OS logo, the splash screen as it does its boot up here. So in just a couple seconds, we'll be back in the login screen as one would expect for this VM. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is in terms of the storage here, as you can see, we're all logged in and have access to the VM once more. One thing I wanted to touch on with the storage over here is instead of having 4 storage data stores that we had before, we now have one that is the .236 IP address for our Synology High Availability Cluster and the name of the folder where that backup image was living, that being Active Backup for Business. We mounted this folder as an NFS data store, and that's why that machine was able to boot up so quickly. We didn't actually need to transfer any data. You're just creating this NFS pathway, for example. So that's definitely good because it happens all automatically for you on the back end. If we hop back over to the main NAS device once more, just to see what it looks like. You can see that that restore option happened in all of about 16 seconds for that Elementary OS VM. Now, let's talk a little bit about instant restore to Synology Virtual Machine Manager. As I mentioned, we have another backup device. We have another Synology NAS backing up that Windows Server VM with Active Backup for Business. So we're going to do an instant restore of that VM into Synology Virtual Machine Manager. With the instant restore to Virtual Machine Manager, you can have an issue with a physical server, VMs, or something like that. Or if your computer goes down for a client, for example, you can then bring up the hypervisor on the Synology NAS device and spin it up on the box itself. And so your recovery time is just bringing in that PC in this example as a virtual machine. You could also do this with physical servers, and you can also do this with VMs from your VMware environment, for example, like what we're going to do in just a second. So let's hop back into that larger device we were messing with, this one right here. And before we dive into things, we're going to actually show you what device this is. It's a DS3617XS device, and it's Intel Xeon. So it's got a powerful processor, good amount of memory. So you definitely want to make sure you're using a device along the same lines of this, especially if you're going to be relying on VMM to spin up these devices in an emergency. You're going to want to choose a more powerful unit. So we're going to go ahead and open up Active Backup for Business. And we're going to go over to virtual machine here. You can see that in this task, we have some server backups that are taking care of this 2016 image here. So what we're going to do now is then highlight this and hit restore. And we can instantly restore it into Synology's Virtual Machine Manager, similar to how we restored into VMware vSphere. So we're just going to use the backups that we took today. We're going to drop it into just our main data store on this unit. And here you can change the specifications for the VM itself. You can give it more cores, more RAM, etc. And you can change the virtual disk settings here if you needed to. And you can change your network features here. We're just going to do our default network, but this is handy if you have more than one NIC on your device. Maybe you have some 1G ports bonded together and then also some 10G ports on the device, and you wanted your VM to run through 10G. You could set that in Virtual Machine Manager and have that be another network option here. But we're going to just choose the default network here. And on this next portion right here, it's just going to prompt you about our VM guest tool. It's very similar to VMware tools, pretty standard stuff right there. And you can also add in different ISO files, BIOS, etc. if you needed to, basically streaming them into the VM before you even get it booted. Now we're going to assign our permissions on this device. This device is actually connected to an LDAP environment. So that's why you're going to see a couple different LDAP users. So this is a good example to show that you can do this with domain users as well as local users. But since I am logged in with the local user, we're going to go ahead and do my Cody H user right here on the local list. And we're going to go ahead and apply this and bring this VM into Virtual Machine Manager. As you can see, it's importing right now, and in just a few seconds, this connect button is going to go live here, and we're going to be able to connect to this VM after we power it on, of course. Just a couple seconds, and now we're able to connect. Now, this is essentially just your web console that launches every time you're in VMware and you click on a VM and that kind of thing. So this is just our version of the web console for Virtual Machine Manager. Now, in just a few seconds, you're going to see a very familiar, those circles spinning around each other in the middle of the screen, the standard Windows boot sequence here, just below that Cyano Core icon. As you can see, those are the circular dots we all know. And in just a few seconds, we're going to have access to the server's login screen. And there we go. And so we now can log into the device as normal, and our network was acquired, all that stuff. So we're able to interact with this VM as normal. We're going to hop back over. One last thing I wanted to make mention of inside of Virtual Machine Manager that I find very handy is under Action. You can actually create a share link for this actual VM here. So you could give this link out to an external user so that they could have access to that VM if they needed to dig through it. Funny story here is I actually was working with a university in our area, in the Seattle area. They had a user that only accessed a very important Excel file through recent files. And so that can be an issue whenever they go to restore. They actually don't know where that file originally lived. So they used this Virtual Machine Manager spin-up to spin up their regular PC. And then they shared out access to that PC to that user so they could find that recent file. And then they just went through normal restore options to get that file. Kind of a funny use case in that scenario, but it just shows you some of the flexibility you have by being able to spin up things on the box itself. So today's demo actually runs on a DS3617XS, as you saw. Again, that's a Xeon processor, 16 gigs of RAM, and it's actually 10G compatible. We have one of these in our lab unit at our main office. It's pretty much the heart and soul of our whole entire deployment there. Our ESXi vCenter environment actually runs off of LUNs on one of these devices. So let's talk about some offsite backup and disaster recovery. We're going to breeze through some snapshot replication stuff here. So as you can see, snapshots are going to be what you use to back up your LUNs, and they allow you to actually do local snapshots of LUNs and replicate them to offsite Synology NAS devices. And you can also do this for shared folders. Now, this is going to be a very beneficial way to use your Synology NAS device because these snapshots are instant. There's almost no performance impact, and they happen up to every 5 minutes. And they can be application consistent with our storage console for VMware. Now, they are also fast recovery, just like creating a LUN happens really fast. You can roll back those LUNs in seconds, and you get offsite replication, as I mentioned, which allows you to fail over to the offsite location. Now, you can also export and import the initial replication. That allows you to seed this replication environment, so you're not sending terabytes and terabytes of data across the wire. So let's walk through setting up snapshots and offsite replication here. Oops. We're going to hop back over to our main NAS device. And we're going to open up our snapshot replication package here. Now you can see we have some replication tasks already occurring. You can easily create local snapshots of the LUNs just by going to settings and enabling and just clicking through the menus, setting up your retention and setting up application consistent snapshots if you want to. But the big portion for disaster recovery, local snapshots are great to use, especially if you're using the device as a file server. You can roll back before the ransomware encryption event, for example. But replication is going to be the big thing for everybody. So let's create another replication task for that LUN we created earlier. We're going to go to the Synology snapshot replication. We're going to use a remote snapshot destination because local is for another volume on this device, but we're going off device. We're going to go ahead and choose a server on our local network by scanning here. But this also works externally to, an external IP or domain name. You just need to make sure you have all your port forwarding set correctly. And we do have a guide for that if you needed to. And we also have a couple devices here in the home lab, like this VMUG New Jersey location. Let's send our data that way. And we're going to use an encrypted connection here. And so right now what's happening is it's actually querying out to the VMUG NJ NAS device here on the local network. It's authenticating my username and then also asking what kind of storage space it has available to it, because you're going to choose where this snapshot lives. Just going to drop it there and send this VMUG LUN right here. We're going to send it over the wire since we're all local here, but this is going to be where you could send your initial copy using external storage. And you can set up your schedule. This schedule is going to be completely separate from the local snapshot schedule because they're actually separate snapshots. Of course, you can go daily, weekend, etc. You can have it go up to every 15 minutes for a replication task. And you can have a transfer window just like Active Backup for Business if you need that. Now, the retention policy is going to be separate once again from the local snapshots, but you can always retain, you could retain up to 256, that's the maximum, or you can configure a retention policy based on this. Now you can replicate local snapshots, but keep in mind that's going to be taking those local snapshots and sending more snapshots and more data across, so that could take a little bit longer. But you could also enable application and consistent snapshots for the replication task also. Keep in mind you need to install the storage console for VMware. That's going to be the current one for anyone using 6.5, I believe U2 and up for VMware. So definitely want to use the storage console for VMware if you need that application consistent snapshot. So we're going to hit next here and apply. And it's going to begin building this replicated LUN on the secondary device. You're going to see a VMUG replica LUN at the secondary location, and it's going to begin this replication task as a whole. Now, as that's occurring, we're going to go ahead and go over to our secondary location. I just want to show you a couple things in the menu before we hop over to the cloud backups. On this other end, you're going to see the other end of the replication task. As you can see, we can see these replica LUNs. It is waiting for the initial replication for the replica right now for that VMUG LUN, but our SHA just finished a recent replication. Likewise, over here in the iSCSI manager is going to be where you see the other end of the LUN, that being the replica LUNs. And as you can see, they're offline. To do a failover, all you would need to do is highlight one of the LUNs in question, go to recovery, and do a failover here. We're healthy, so we don't need to do that, but you could force a failover and that kind of thing. And that would bring these LUNs live on this side. So all you would need to do is then retarget with that LUN, apply a target to it, and then map that out to your ESXi host where you can re-register VMs. Then once you're done, you unlink from that initiator, you let the target go back to a ready state, and then you come back to recovery and you can easily fail back your data and bringing that data that you created at the DR location and reprotecting with that data at the main original source so that you have all your data consistent even after a failover. Now let's talk a little bit about backups to the cloud real quick. These are going to be backing up your Active Backup for Business VM data. And so it works with any of our major cloud providers. You're going to be using our Hyper Backup application that is available in Packet Center, and it allows you to back up, to pretty much any of the major cloud providers, S3, Azure, Google. But we definitely think you should try out Synology C2. That's our cloud because it integrates with the Synology NAS device. You're going to have a backup explorer directly on the NAS that allows you to see into your cloud backups, and also you have a web-based backup explorer like in that menu you see on the left. There's also no surprise restoration fees, so there's no ingress or egress fees. When you need your data the most, we're not going to shortchange you or have any gotchas there. And also you can encrypt your data before uploading with client-side encryption, that's AES 256-bit encryption and RSA 2048-bit encryption. Now let's walk through setting up Hyper Backup real quick. We're going to hop back over to our device. And we're going to open up Hyper Backup here. You can see we have a couple tasks already created, but let's follow the backup creation wizard here. And we're going to shoot it off to C2, but again, you could go to pretty much any one of these other ones. So right now we're going to log into our C2 environment. I might already be logged into my C2 environment already on this machine, but we'll see here. Looks like I'm already logged in. So it's basically going to take me to my storage overview screen. You can see we're going to our Frankfurt data center, but we do have a US data center if you needed. If you needed your data inside the US, there's one in the Seattle area. And we're going to give it access to our hyper backup task. Here you can change your directory, but here's going to be an important menu. For backing up active backup data, you just want to back up this folder right here. Again, take heed of these information bubbles. This tells you that this is where your real deduplicated data lives, and this grayed out folder is actually just virtual files, so there's not actual backup files there. So you just need to back up this folder here. And here you can back up configs. We're not going to do that, but definitely handy if you're using Synology directory server or DNS server on the NAS. You can back up those configs and restore them with ease here. But again, we're not going to do that. And we're going to go ahead and type this in with a new name. And you can enable some of the advanced features, namely bandwidth limitation, that kind of thing. But client-side encryption is enabled here at the bottom. That's going to be, again, that AES 256-bit encryption and RSA 2048-bit. So it's military grade. Even if you're in Synology C2, we have no backdoor into the system. So make sure you take care of those keys like they're gold, because if you lose those keys, you're not going to have access to your data any longer. Here you can enable backup rotation, and the big portion here is how deep the retention on a hyper backup goes. It can go up to 65,000 versions in this scenario here, so you can stay compliant in pretty restrictive environments like HIPAA or finance law, that kind of thing. Now we're applying, and it's creating that directory inside of C2. It's going to basically ask us if we want to back up. Now we're going to hit no because we already have some backups all finished. And the last thing I wanted to touch on in terms of hyper backup is what you can do with it once you restore from the cloud. Now I have this scenario right here, this VMUG New Jersey device, sitting at a point in time where it's already done a couple restores from C2 for that active backup folder we actually sent up to the cloud already. So I've done a couple restores, as you have seen. If we go into Active Backup for Business, we can actually reconstitute this backup data inside a brand new instance. You can see we don't have anything in virtual machine, no tasks, no storage even. So what you could do is actually relink that storage we restored from Hyper Backup, that being that Active Backup for Business folder. It can tell it has a virtual machine task and even can tell what the tasks are. So we're going to highlight and relink, hit OK. And we're going to go back to virtual machine and authenticate our hypervisor, because it does not store your password inside of the backup image, which is definitely a good thing. And we're online once more. And you can see into the the ESXi environment, excuse me. And under task list, you can see we have all of those tasks now populated. So then we could begin to do an instant restore like we did earlier with Active Backup. And this is all done reconstituting the data from the cloud in a brand new instance of Active Backup for Business. This would be the same kind of workflow you would do, especially if your NAS was the victim of a fire, theft, or something along those lines. You could restore from the cloud, reconstitute your data, and restore right here. So some final housekeeping items. I know I'm running just a little bit long here. So with Synology, you have a couple different options. We have our partner program with MSPs for value-added resellers, that kind of thing. You'll have access to an account manager who helps with partner exclusive deals, project consultations, and the like. Now, if you're an enterprise user of UC, FS, SA, XS Plus devices, all's not lost if you want some interaction with your vendor. We have a business advantage program. I work with this team quite a bit, and we help with end users. We help answer any questions about your deployment. If you ever have any kind of support issue or anything like that, we can help you along with that. And we also help with any kind of project consultations you might need for any expansions or maybe future deployments. So definitely reach out to us. We have a couple different contact pieces right here if you wanted to reach out. You should be getting this in a PDF as well. And we're going to take a little bit of questions here. I do have a question sheet that I can take a look at. So feel free to shoot in some questions, and also remember to take our survey so you can be entered to win our raffle, which is again a DS220 Plus. So I'm going to stop the screen share here and pop over to my sheet. Okay, so it looks like we have some good ones here. So it looks like we had one from Todd. Do they need identical physical disks or capacity about high availability? So yes, in high availability, the disk capacity should be the same on both the active and the passive. And actually, if you have an array that is X amount of disks at one size for bays 1 through 6, and then a different size through 7 through 12, then you would want to make sure that you have the same type of drive in each corresponding bay. So you need to have kind of like the identical architecture in both head units and their expansions, etc. And then you should be good to go. And actually, HA Manager will actually warn you if it can tell that your architecture isn't even identical. So whenever you go to create the cluster, it'll actually do a scan to make sure everything's in line. Looks like, is it possible to restore from outside of the active backup program, or is it easy to import prior backups to another Synology in the event of a major failure? From Greg. You can actually, you actually might have just saw that you actually are able to replicate that active backup data to a secondary location. We didn't do that. We used the hyper backup side of things, restoring from the cloud, but you could also do that with replication and fail over that active backup data through the shared folder replication, and then relink it in active backup like we just saw, and then you could reconstitute on a secondary Synology NAS, restoring into another VMware environment or spinning up on that NAS device itself. Okay, looks like we have another one from Greg. With backups given a complete building network knock failure, say a whole building burns down, so I've lost my Synologies, but I have the data. Can it be imported into another Synology to restore data, where is the active backup data stay stored? So the database itself wouldn't be interacted with. Again, if this happened right here where there was a whole building network knock failure, you didn't have a secondary Synology NAS, but you were backing up to the cloud, it would be the same hyper backup restore pathway that we just did. You would restore using this hyper backup task. You would then relink your active backup data like we just did, and then restore from that backup image. So it looks like we have one from Todd on top of that. Will HA also cover the Synology applications that run on Synology? For example, if I run Home Assistant on the Synology chassis. So high availability was actually going to replicate the supported packages pretty well. So we don't have specific info on this for third-party developed packages such as Home Assistant, but in general, it does sync all of the DSM operating system settings and packages over to the secondary device. So like if you're using, Synology Drive, for example, for an ability to actually access your data and your file server externally, that would also be something that fails over during an HA failover. All those different Synology first-party packages are definitely supported with that. In a while, I'm not sure it supports blah blah. Okay, so it looks like we had one from Alex. Is it recommended to use the Synology VAI VIB for ESXi? I haven't seen it updated in a while, and I'm not sure it supports 7. And it's always been problematic with GSS. Would always advise to remove it, and it causes a lot of issue. So with the 7.0 support, just keep in mind that, like as mentioned in the previous presentation, whenever there's big updates from like 6.7 to 7, for example, there's some backup programs that need a little bit extra time to get everything kind of recoded and that kind of thing. So for active backup for business, I believe we're still working on getting that full 7.0 support and that kind of thing. So we're right now in our lab, we're on 6.7. I was actually on a 6.7 image myself. We're doing that for a couple of reasons. One, active backup is still being worked on for that support. But also in my home lab, for example, some of my NICs aren't supported in 7.0. So we would need to do a couple other upgrades in that sense. Let's see if I have any other in the chat here. Looks like we're running out of questions here. Cool. I think that's about wrapping it up today. Keep in mind, you might see a chat from Sarah here that we have a survey here with SurveyMonkey. Make sure you fill that out so that you can see join in to win that Synology NAS device. Again, it's a DS220 Plus. It's going to be able to run pretty much everything you saw here today, including active backup for business. Now, if you wanted to do virtual machine spin-ups and backup verification, you'll need to get some RAM upgrades because it only has 2 gigs in it. But for any kind of home server use or any use in general that you saw today, it's definitely going to be a good one to go with. With that said, thanks for having me on. Thanks again, VMUG community with New Jersey. It was good to interact with you guys.